Uh, so, so just want to thank Erica again. We met at Sri this past year. Had some follow-ups from really engaged conversations, as you could see, about grandparents and all things school finance. I have my good friend and colleague Raja Smart on the call, who has been part of this work since its inception. And so we're going to walk you through essentially three products that were a result of the pilot work we did in Michigan, um, and hope that you are as excited about critically looking at school finance as we are. And so without further ado, I'll kind of get us started. Um, so the project, go ahead, Smart. You can roll. This is an organizing piece. So our partners, Eastern Michigan University, which is where I'm housed, University of Wisconsin. I did my graduate work there, and so we partner with the Wisconsin Center for Ed Research. Um, Brad Carl is a co-director there, has a background in survey, design, analysis, descriptive stats, stuff like that. Jed Richardson is a senior economist. I read more econ papers in the last 3 years than I've read in my life. They just speak different languages, which is kind of cool. And then Tennessee State obviously is where Dr. Smart is, and then U of M is where he did his graduate work at. So go blue. And then we have another colleague who is a mixed methods researcher, Tim Gutterman, who is in family medicine over at U of M, who's a collaborator as well. So we'll walk you through our conceptual framework. The theoretical tools that we use are critical race theory, critical policy analysis. We hyper-focus on school finance reform policy. So basically, early 90, mid 90 across the country, school finance reform was changing. A very brief toe in the water review of relevant research that we think are important for today. What our research questions were that drove this, the methodology that we used across all three pieces of the pilot thus far. Some important findings that we thought were really surprising for us. And then we hope that we have enough time at the end to really kind of hit or lean into some policy solution conversations and talk a little bit about our future directions for our research.
And just to note, we kind of police one another. So if you hear me say funding Caldwell, that means keep it moving, because sometimes we get so deep in it, we get to run in our mouths, and we want to be able to have time for questions. So if you hear me say that, it's not that I'm losing my mind. I'm just saying that we have to progress forward.
So this research applies critical race theory, critical policy analysis to investigate specifically. This pilot work was done for Michigan school funding system, which was changed in 1993 with a constitutional amendment that went to the ballot. And our focus is on structural racism and discrimination that are embedded in the school finance, education laws, housing policy, and eventually is what we see as residential and educational segregation, which some of our colleagues over at Stanford and the Reardon team have also articulated in their work. So the purpose and context, again, to really try to examine if there's existence of structural racism and discrimination. So if you think about the Aspen Institute talks about structural racism is those structures, policies that are essentially isolating certain sets of individuals or groups, discriminatory practices. So the concrete example I often give is, are you keeping one group away from certain resources from different from other groups, right? And the structures that we're talking about here, starting at the Constitution for Michigan, coming forward and how those things are enacted through the Michigan Department of Treasury, which is the tax collection agency, and the Michigan Department of Ed, which disseminates school finance funding. The second two bullets talk about our pilot work focused on Michigan, and our initial analysis has led to three distinct papers. So one was focused on charter school. We have about 300 or so charter districts in the state of Michigan out of 800. The second paper focused on quantifying equity measures around local fiscal effort and funding level. And then the third paper was focused on critical race theory, critical policy analysis to index variance or difference across districts. We use administrative data to analyze through that work. Our ongoing work, will continue to use those same tools and principles and try to extend them out. Smart.
Thank you. So as Dr. Caldwell had indicated, a lot of this focuses on the constitutional amendment of Proposal A. Again, when you talk about an amendment to Constitution to reform school finance, Michigan did that. And it was a call to action to many issues or complaints about property tax, actually coming from a majority of our white residents in Michigan. One of the main things that we pull from Proposal A is whether or not the proposal was written in a way to address the issues that have been happening historically. We're talking about inequity in property, inequity in school funding, inequity in many things. But one of the things what Michigan tried to do with Proposal A is equalize funding. Now you have to be very cautious with the term equalize. Equalize from where? So you're equalizing from the state level, which they did. They did equalize state funding at the state level. However, at the local level, you still see that inequality in the way that funds are, dispersed, because you're still looking at property tax. Okay, and we'll get into that a little bit more. It did introduce school choice and charter districts. Charter districts were meant to come into the state to act as high quality, and I'm gonna say that again, high quality educational choice. However, if you're placing charter schools in areas that have been historically inequitably served, then the charter school is not serving the purpose that it should. So this is one of the things that we found. Proposal A really focused on, and I'm gonna say it one more time, equalization from the state level, thus a foundational allowance of funding, so per pupil funding. So it's a little different when you're looking at it in terms of geographic areas. So in order, and this was the basis of the research, we really wanted to focus in on the policies, because that's a big part of critical policy analysis, as well as critical race theory. We really wanted to examine, having a strength to examine the policy itself, but use a very specific lens. And since we're talking about discriminatory practices, racism, and equity, we really wanted to have the strength behind our lens. And I'm just going to say this, Caldwell might kick me later, but we really want to use this view of the transformative paradigm, that lens that takes your personal experience. So you have identified your experience. Since we are both kids, he's just a kid from Detroit, I'm a kid from Flint. And if you ask me about the water, I will find you and I will shake you, okay? So we are both from the cities of Flint and Detroit, and we have that lens coming up in those areas. So we really want to focus in on a tool or a lens that would give us the power to kind of look at these policies and the way the systems are, or excuse me, the way that the reform was developed. So we use transformative paradigm. Critical race theory really helped us examine historical policies such as ESCA. Oh man, you can go back to, we looked at various legal cases. We also examined the policies that had been developed for school funding 3 or 4 decades back. So we could just make sure that we were drilling in on that. We kind of later on ran upon critical policy analysis, understanding that, I know for those of you who I'm missing the gentleman's name, but it's a very popular book in policy, how you examine policy. I know you all know what I'm talking about. I'm making this assumption, but I know because we've all seen this book. I know his last name starts with an F, but I can't remember. But anyway, just thinking about that, it also examines these historical contexts and looks at multifaceted systems, characters, the socio-political things that were going on at the time that made this policy what it was. which drove us into how we looked at school finance reform. And this is literally focusing on the inequities caused by poverty. And this, again, reliance on local property tax. When you look at a home, just as an example, my mother's home is 2,600 and some square feet in Flint. The house is only worth $40,000, but it's a beautiful home. You take that same home and you drop it in a Grand Blanc, which is a suburb in Michigan, you're going to pay at least $300,000 for that house. So it's a very telling component. Some of the pieces that we really drilled in on, for example, recent studies find this consistent causal relationship between higher spending and various student outcomes related to uh, proposal A. Public school funding inequities, that Cullen and Loeb piece really drilled in for us, is a very strong piece that found that we still have this kind of race neutral public school funding language. If you paid any attention to No Child Left Behind, you see the same kind of language there when that came about. But Michigan school finance system it's definitely centralized at the state level, but it's still not accounting for the local issues and the rising costs in urban areas. And actually, I'm going to pass this one on to Dr. Caldwell. He loves tables, so I'm going to let him explain this table.
So this is our research design for examining school funding in Michigan. What you see left to right, just in brief, are I often explain to my graduate students, like, you have these theoretical constructs, and so no one uses the entire construct typically, right? And so I try to be very specific about what are we gleaning from that particular thing. So from critical policy analysis, the tenets that we took were around is there a distinct difference between policy rhetoric and what's practiced in reality? And then social stratifications exist, and do policies reinforce those stratifications? And then from critical race theory, the same thing. So most scholars will say there are about 10 central tenets that are in that body of work. We're pulling on or drawing on two in this particular phase of our work. One is that race and racism are central in terms of fixtures. And then the second is this notion around intersectionality of identities. In terms of intersectionality, the way that we frame it in our work is around two constructs. So one is the race construct for a kid, Black, white, et cetera. And specifically, if you are receiving or not receiving free or reduced lunch, which is our look or our attempt to look at students who show up with additional need or impoverished conditions. Going further to the right, you see school finance reform. And so again, we're drawing on this piece from the National Bureau of Economic, this working paper from Debris, which really just highlights the fact that we have an over-reliance on local property taxation. So you'll ask, where's the structural racism in that? Well, the structure that sets tax policy in Michigan is the Treasury Department. It's not real estate agents, it's not realtors. The state of Michigan sets state equalized value, the millage rates and the millage caps. So for example, in 93, when the Constitution was amended, charter schools in Michigan were capped at 6 meals out the gate. Traditional districts, the other 500 plus in Michigan, have an 18 meal tax base. So the second piece is that there are causal relationships between higher spending and various student outcomes. And so not only Jackson and that group recently, but there's a faculty member over at Michigan published a really well cited piece, Money Matters. And so every additional $1,000 we spend, we see better outcomes for kids from third through potentially graduating high school and even attending a 2-year or 4-year institution. The data sets that we use, so the Michigan Equity Measures is a construct that we developed, and that came with inspiration from the National Report Card from the Baker team over at Rutgers and the Education Law Center. So they have those 4 measures that they use, but they really framed it around fairness, and we were really trying to frame around equity. And so we looked at 2 of those measures, local fiscal effort and funding level. using publicly available secondary data around Michigan finance, enrollment data, property wealth, et cetera. And then the policy analysis paper, we looked at financial health indicators. There are about 37 states across the country that use this particular type of categorization for fiscal health of their districts at the district level, but the state operationalizes that. And then you can see the data sources in the last column more specifically. One additional technique that we did apply to the equity measures was we used the American Community Survey data, and we created or we adopted our own adapted comparable wage index for geographic differences in things like teacher wages, for example, in Northern Michigan versus if you're in a more urban area like Ann Arbor, those kind of things. And here's a boiled down version of what I just explained in totality. So district revenues, that's Michigan data, American Survey data, which we created our comparable wage index, and that comes out of NCES. The district level taxable property value comes from the Michigan Department of Treasury. And then the Michigan Center for Education Performance Indicators, which is our main education data hub in Michigan, provides demographic data, student enrollment, free and reduced lunch rates, those kind of things. Smart, I'll run through this and then pass it.
Actually, I got it, and I'll pass you the next. Yeah.
Okay, good.
So some of the things that we really drilled in on, for example, is Dr. Caldwell just mentioned Baker really gave us the kind of the blueprint to kind of build for what we have. There's nobody in the state of Michigan. I think the closest, and correct me if I'm wrong, Caldwell, is Arson, the group out of Michigan State, who had done this work. So it really helped us kind of drill in the low ebb piece, low ebb and Cullen that I just talked about, really helped us understand Proposal A more. I think we had focused in on Proposal A just unconsciously through other work. I think my dissertation was really focused in on Proposal A as well, and we just found this piece and really stayed with it. Reardon really kind of helped drive, again, out of Stanford, really helped drive us in the direction of how can we represent this information? How can we represent the data and come up with a tool? Because that's really what, education loves tools. We have to come up with a tool of how we can share this body of work across the nation. So Reardon really was a good driver for that. In terms of property, whiteness is property. I think one of my students had a really good example about this is in terms of gentrification. With whiteness as property, they have the ability to move and go wherever they can. They can go into different areas. So when you think about things like that, I think the Gotham piece and the Leonardo piece really helped us understand what does that actually look like when you say whiteness is property. When you read it within critical race theory, you can get kind of a gleaming of what that means, but this work really helped us drill into what does that actually mean. It's more about power than it is about, well, it's not just economics, it's about movement. It's about how we view things as a society. So those pieces were really helpful in designing the research. In terms of the national and state law bucket, because we like to put everything in buckets. So you may hear us say that, well, in this bucket we have. So in the national and state law bucket, we really went back to the policies, the laws, and things that have driven things over decades. The Michigan Revised School Code, again, that constitutional amendment. I mean, I don't know if you know how important that is, but this was an amendment to the Constitution on school reform. Really helped us kind of see where we were going as a state. In terms of the legal pieces, Durant and Milliken versus Bradley, again, focused on, are we being equitable with how we release funds? And these are lawsuits brought against the state in terms of how money was being allocated across the board. In terms of the analysis, and Caldwell, please, if I'm shooting through this too fast for you, let me know. The analysis component really helped us. You can't go wrong with Cresswell. Okay, Cresswell is one of those pieces that we use for everything. But Cresswell, Mertens, we talked about the transformative paradigm and how important that is to us. meaning you have to take into account the socio-political nature of what you're studying. And being that we both are from those areas, it really helped us drill in our lens and keep race centralized to the entire study. And that's key. We had to keep race centralized. And that was one of the things our colleague Tim Gutterman really expressed as well. Baker, again, you heard Dr. Caldwell speak about that a little bit in terms of using or revising their model to focus more on equity versus fairness in the state of Michigan. And then lastly, Young and Diem really helped me personally understand that paradigm of critical policy analysis and how we can implement that along with critical race theory. Our research questions were fairly simple, and we vacillated over these. That's the word of the day, actually, for us. We vacillated for these over time. One, how does district per pupil funding in Michigan vary by race and income? Two, does variation by race and income depend on whether funding is from state or local sources? Thus, you see funding level. Three, how does district property wealth in Michigan vary by race and income? And lastly, how does the proportion of property wealth in Michigan districts commit to local education funding vary by race and income? So again, you're seeing us really focusing in on that race and keeping that central. Oh, well.
Okay, so really easy. We try to share our methodological stances and tools. And so you see here, we use administrative data. We had 3 methodological techniques or tools that we use to focus on the relationships of family income, district enrollment, and property wealth. This adapted comparable wage index for teachers, again, was for locale-based measures of market conditions, essentially affecting educator salary, wages, adjustments to district education revenues for labor costs. So again, I give the example of if you're in Sault Ste. Marie versus if you're in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or something like that, right? So we wanted to try to account for that. The CWIF was developed by NCES to calculate cost adjustment factors using geographically specific average wages and salaries of college graduates. And that's from Corman in 2019. I actually met him at a conference and he was so surprised somebody had read his paper or used the tool. It was hilarious, but nice guy. And then we had the American Community Survey data from 2014 and 19, which is how we did the adaptation to NCS methodology. On the next slide, you'll see the 2 measures we were inspired by the Baker and Rutgers group in Education Law Center. So I'll just briefly say, funding level describes the amount of revenue districts receive related to race. And here we're looking at specific percentages of Black students, and our unit is the district here, of course. And then income is measured by the district's percentage of free and reduced lunch students. Again, looking at that notion around income. So with that, we focus specifically on funding disparities related to race and income, keeping race kind of central to the thing that we're asking here. The overall state and local level revenues that are provided to school districts facilitate the comparison for the average per pupil spending across districts, and that came directly from the Baker team. So we tried to contextualize a national measure because in the report cards, the state is the unit of analysis that they're using. So we're trying to modify it and adapt it to a useful tool like Dr. Smith talked about. Local fiscal effort, again, the notion that we put local in front is different because at the national report card level, it's simply the fiscal effort level, and they use GDP. But for us, this is a district's property wealth, and what they commit to a local education funding. So we created a ratio around the district's local education revenue to their taxable value of, and we have 4 categories of taxation for residential housing here. So homestead, non-homestead, commercial, and industrial property within districts. And so from the 1718 Baker piece, we needed to replace the GDP that they use in their calculation with taxable property value. And that's how we got that data from the state. We use multiple years to try to reduce the effects of year-to-year variation in the measure. And then the ratio of the district's local education revenue to the taxable value of those 4 property property taxation components to the district. The only other kind of key things that we think people should know, and we try to spend a lot of time making sure people know the language we're using, are taxable value, are those four categories I just referenced. The fiscal fitness, again, is this the district's financial strength or the fund balance to revenue ratio derived by dividing the ending funding balance by revenues. And that shows up in our policy analysis paper that we'll talk about a little bit later when we index districts. Free and reduced lunch here are low-income students who receive a free or reduced lunch meal. Most of us know what that is. And then district funding structures. And so in Michigan, we have hold harmless, charter, and traditional. Hold harmless are those districts that the state agreed when they got the amendment passed would not be held to the change in millage rate. And so there are 40 districts that are not under the guise of they can't raise millage rate or they had to equalize with the other school community. So home harmless can basically raise property taxes anytime they want to for non-operational expenses or expenditures. In their local tax property, they can also raise additional things like sinking funds or tech bonds and those kind of things. And they usually have large school loan bond programs. One example would be maybe 5 years ago, Ann Arbor Public Schools went to the private bond market, not the state, for 30, they have 30 school facility buildings, none rated lower than a B, and they were able to generate $1 billion in school bond revenue. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Largest bond in Michigan history. Charters receive higher foundation allowance than hold harmless, but charters cannot raise property taxes on their own, and that's a law. And then traditionals operate based on the tax funding that they have in their local areas, the contiguous areas. Findings from our initial study. So we found that the average Black student receiving a free or reduced lunch in Michigan receives roughly about $411 less in per pupil revenue than the average white student who has that same codification receiving free or reduced lunch, and that $783 less than the average white student who is not receiving free or reduced lunch. The disparities we consider stem from the differences in local district revenues, and that the result from vast differences in Black-white property wealth. And so you have about 20 districts in Michigan that serve the vast majority of Black students in the state of Michigan. On average, this was a really interesting piece. On average, 1% of a 1 percentage point increase in a district's portion of Black students who are receiving free or reduced lunch provision is associated with losing $2,354 in taxable property value per pupil. From our analysis, we were able to infer that roughly if you're enrolling about 1,000 Black students and those students are receiving a free and reduced lunch provision, you're on average going to be losing $1.3 million in additional revenue from a district that is identical in size and nature with no Black students or students who receive free and reduced lunch. So what we found most interesting about those three things I just shared is that it's almost as if the state is de-incentivizing serving the students who need more. This funding is sufficient or equivalent to essentially hiring an additional 21 teachers. And we did an average salary of about $50,000 across the board with benefits. And we know statistically from people like, I would say Gloria Ladson Billings, or I'm drawing a blank on her name. She did a Credo study some years ago. Linda Darling Hammonds and some other folks that like teachers statistically have the largest impact on kids' outcomes, right? So you can see, based on where the needier kids are in Michigan, we can afford less human resources for said kid. And so that was a very important finding for us. This is probably my favorite illustration of our work, or one of them. So district taxable value property per pupil by district is on the left there. And then you can see on the bottom, the district percentage of Black students and Black students who receive free and reduced lunch. Is there a question from Margaret? No. The circle size represents the magnitude of the average taxable value per pupil. And we highlighted Detroit because it's still the largest city in the state of Michigan. And you can see the difference in average per pupil taxable value between Black students receiving free and reduced lunch and white students. But the more property value you have, the less free and reduced lunch or Black students you're serving. And as you get more students, you have less taxable revenue. It was so clear. And so this is a really important piece of our work. On the next slide, one of the highlights that we have here is that this is about local fiscal effort. So the taxable value per pupil revenues by race and free and reduced lunch provision. The circle size, again, represents the magnitude of the average taxable value per pupil for each race. And then we also have the free and reduced lunch provision identified as well. So here you see on average, Black students attend districts with substantially higher local fiscal effort. And remember, the local fiscal effort represents how much you are allowing yourself to be taxed to go to the educational enterprise within your contiguous area. And so what we found interesting was that approximately 0.7 to 1 percentage points greater than districts with white students, essentially Black parents are allowing themselves to be taxed at a higher rate than their white counterparts, although they have the counter, they have less property wealth than the counter. So the myth is often like Black parents don't want to invest in their kids, maybe, hyperbole, of course, right? But here we see quantitatively Black families and communities pay higher portions of their property wealth to go to education, but receive less in terms of total revenue available. And the next piece, just in brief, because we have such a large charter market here, we did want to share a piece from that. And so Black students account for about 50% of all charter school students in Michigan. Again, we have about 300 charter districts out of 812, compared to 15 and 14% respectively of Black students who attend the more wealthy hold harmless districts and even the traditional districts. Approximately 30% of the Black students who are receiving free and reduced lunch attend a charter school, excuse me, while approximately 17% of Black students who do not receive free and reduced lunch provision do the same. The big piece for us here was that we found, based on our analyses, that the Michigan Charter School Finance portion of our school finance system is reinforcing racial and socioeconomic inequity and inequality by providing less per pupil funding for Black students, who are the majority of the students who attend those institutions, and those students who are Black and receiving free and reduced lunch. Here's another graphic just for your benefit to see. Charter schools disproportionately are serving Black students in Michigan. So again, before 93, charter schools didn't exist in Michigan, and they disproportionately serve Black students. If you recall, the provision when it was enacted was tax reform. There were 4 goals: tax reform, equalization of school funding, create schools of choice. I always forget the 4th one, SMART. But those are the main ones, right? But the state at the time said, if you open a charter school, you get less millage. So the system set it up to not adequately serve the very people that you said you wanted to open it up for. Just a consideration.
Well, and in that same note, we have to make it known too, though, that the state did there was a change where They don't have access to local millages, but they do have access to intermediate school district and RESA funds. So if there are funds available, they can, but that was a later amendment within this decade. So it still hasn't addressed the inequity issue, but they did try to amend it. The last piece was really the last paper in this pilot in the pilot research is focused on school funding. So we wanted to really drill down on something very specific. You heard Dr. Caldwell talk a little bit about this, the HR issue with hiring teachers and not having the funds to do so. So we really wanted to drill down into school funding and how the policy really impacts the ability for urban schools, human resources departments to adequately fund and bring in the people needed. So what we found is on average that both districts with high percentages of Black and FRL students have a state taxable value per pupil of approximately $1,895 and $2,400 less than that for districts with high percentage of white students who are non-FRL. Also, districts with high percentages of Black and FRL students have a state taxable value per pupil that is approximately $1,895 to $2,400 less than that for districts with, again, high percentages of white and non-FRL students. And just overall, just in the essence of time, we know that Black students live in low taxable but high cost areas. So their per pupil expenditures are higher than white students overall. And that illustrates that full disparity that we've been talking about. Lastly, while the average white and free and reduced student is in a district with an adjusted revenue of approximately $11,900 and a local fiscal effort of approximately 1.8%, the average Black and FRL student is in a district that produces almost 1% point higher effort, thus yielding approximately $500 less in revenue. So some of the things that we thought about in terms of policies, we've been looking at other states and how they're, whether it's, I'm going to forget the word, and I know he's going to remind me, adequacy funding or what we call recalibration out of Wisconsin. So what we found is if you utilize an evidence-based adequacy funding model that allows school systems to recalibrate, kind of like if you're thinking about title funding, you get the 4 buckets of funding. And if you're an over 90% district with FRL, then that money, whatever money is left over, is allocated to those districts that have over 90%. It kind of works in the same vein. Recalibration is the continuing process of determining the resources needed for schools that have specific needs. Also, this whole idea of split rate taxation. This uses a formula to apply a different tax rate to the taxable values of properties in the area. So with a higher rate applied to land value and lower rate applied to structures and improvements. Now, this probably would have worked really well in Flint, where we had multiple plants. And I'm sure if you know anything about Flint, once the plants left, so did the population and the schools. Many of the schools that I went to are closed now, but it's just a point of how do you get that back? How do you find the resources needed? Well, split rate taxation is a good idea. Discourages the holding of vacant and underutilized property and encourages the development and redevelopment of property. In some urban areas, you'll see folks come in and buy property and hold it just to drive the value down so they can then redevelop it as something else. Well, this discourages that. Land taxes are also widely considered an ideal source of local public revenue because they match government spending to the value it creates. So taxing land is more fiscally productive in the long run. And then we see the little bouncing bubbles. It's just more information, and we can share this all with you at a different time.
Smart, I do want to add one thing about the split rate. I think one of the encouraging signs is that it does not add additional cost to local residents. And so it's revenue generating, but not a new burden to these under-resourced or de-invested communities, right? And that's a really important thing.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. And lastly, we also, during our time at the Michigan Department of Education, we kind of fell in love with the idea of coordinated school health. I myself came up through a school that was a community school. So we kind of had that idea of coordinated school health, which is now whole school, whole community, whole child. When you're thinking about a framework of funding, how do you find these components to fund the entire child? Meaning all of these components, where it's physical education, activity, nutrition, health education, social emotional. I'm sure you notice across some states where they're pulling out social emotional and making it like this one thing. And we tend to forget that it's a part of a holistic model. And we have to hit all of those components like a quality assurance system. Don't go to Smiling Caldwell because you know that's my joint. I love the quality assurance system, but that's essentially what this is. It's hitting all of these buckets: family engagement, community involvement, employee wellness. Well, it's been known to support urban schools to be better, especially in inequitable times. So if they have the funding to enact something of this nature, you'll see a change. It is an equity-driven model in itself. So when you're thinking about policy, when you're thinking about school finance reform, having this idea in mind is very helpful. And then lastly, look at that. We made it to the last slide. I'm so proud of us. But some of the things I'm going to actually start with where we're looking. So because of this, we're looking at taking this nationally. Michigan was really the pilot. And we're looking at going just nationally to examine policy and see how that impacts school funding reform and how school funding is enacted right now. But it's got us thinking a lot about how do we think about school funding and the characteristics that impact school funding. Thus, critical geography. Critical geography has always been known as this kind of piece that focuses on the environment. How much land mass do we have? Water. Well, now it's digging into the population. What does the race look like? Given these characteristics, you can determine the outcomes of certain areas using critical geography. And next, special education. Special education is typically just included in all funding and not necessarily pulled out. So we want to take a special lens and look at how special education funding is impacted with this very lens. So we're looking to expand this model, not just from Michigan, but into 6 states. If Caldwell wants to go into detail on that, I'm sure he will. But just an overview, we are looking at taking this into 6 states. And we have, in this pilot research, we've had 4 pieces released. Okay, yeah. So the last one is literally the perceptions of what we call our educational influencers in Michigan. This would be like your school administrators, chief operating officers, those that make decisions related to school reform or school funding reform. And what we did is we looked at just their perceptions of our current school model to see what their thoughts were. Caldwell?
So we'll have about 10 minutes. I just want to say to put some definition on this. So like all the pilot work is in Michigan. It was 4 phases. We are finishing phase 3. So the first was trying to design these equity measures in Michigan. The second was taking and integrating what we found there, creating a survey protocol that then went out to those folks that Smart talked about. We had about 200 respondents. In that same survey, those folks who wanted to sign up to be further interviewed are part of our next phase, which that collecting those data now. And then the final phase is this mixing and trying to figure out what did we actually find out and what can a mixed method study tell us about this. So there are really 2 big things from the pilot. One is trying to design the science that can address the social justice question that we're asking, and we needed critical tools and mixed methods tools to do that work, or those are good justifications. Well, needed that stuff. The second thing that we're moving to is a 6-state analysis where we're trying to take what we learned about the equity measures and apply it longitudinally. So a similar design around sequential explanatory mixed methods, where we're trying to design on the front end some quantitative findings, but we know they won't tell us the full picture, right? And so we're asking a different question, and that's basically what's been the return on investment for school finance reform and outcomes for kids, right? And so you have the moderators, predictors, and outcomes that we're trying to really investigate, and we're trying to look at what is the new scientific tools that we need to answer those questions. And so For the phase one of that work, we're going to be looking at a structural equational model around mimic, so multiple indicator, multiple cause analyses techniques. I'll stop there, and then we want to design a survey, interview, so forth and so on. So you kind of get that. So that's kind of where we are with the work. And we'll pause. We got 10 minutes. Thanks, Dr. Smart. That was
Good
dope.
job, sir. We usually just ramble on, so we good job.
That was great. Thank you both so much. Could we take down the slides and then maybe folks can turn on their cameras if they are able, and we can have a little bit more of a conversation.
Thanks, Margaret and Victoria. So can I ask a question to the group? So what didn't you like about what we presented? What do you disagree with? What is just burning like I don't get that, or I don't agree with that? Sometimes you want to start with some disagreement. It's okay.
Who'd like to go first?
Oh wow, it's a hush. We quieted the
Sorry,
group.
I don't disagree with anything. I think it's a great presentation, but I was wondering if you can explain a little bit more the was it split tax? I think that's what it was called. I'm not as familiar with that. And sorry, I'm off camera. My internet's a little bit unstable.
Yeah. So two things. So split rate is trying to do, I'm boiling this down, of course, right? Like it's a report from, I think it's the Lincoln Project. It's like 150 or 200 pages. Basically, they're trying to do economic development, right? For underutilized, under-resourced, vacant properties. Don't hold it for 30 years and wait on gentrification. We're going to tax you right now, right? And it's a strategy to do two things. One, to not have dilapidated homes or housing or residential areas, or some of us live in communities where schools are up and no one's in them anymore. So you have all this stuff going on. And so it's saying, let's move those off the sideline and put them back into economic activity. If you're not going to move it in, we're still going to tax you along the way. So you normally can kind of skirt by without paying taxes for quite a while. And this is saying we're going to tax you at such a heavy load that you're going to offload, develop, but you're not going to want to keep paying these taxes. That revenue that's generated is not being collected right now to go towards that local fiscal effort within a community. So one idea is that it generates additional dollars that are not even existent, right, to go towards educational enterprise within whatever your contiguous area is. At the same time, what I see one of the benefits is for like a community like Flint, you don't have a huge residential tax base that can afford to be taxed at a higher level. If I use Detroit, Detroit is the 7th highest municipal area in the country, I think. So you can't just add more taxation to Detroit, right? So residents are going to say, well, we want more for schools, but don't tax me anymore. We've already showed you that Black folks in particular in Michigan are already taxed at a premium. Well, how do you get additional revenue and not pass the burden? So split rate is more about trying to do that. But I talked to a CPA and he said basically there's no tax law that's perfect. And so I'd have to go with that. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you so much.
I mean, I don't know if I should say this, but a good example in Detroit of someone owning property and holding it until they can actually develop it into something else would be the Little Caesars Arena in downtown Detroit. So that was a great example of where that property was held, tons of property was held for quite some time. It was not redeveloped to benefit the residents of Detroit. So split tax rate would then tax them to a level where you want to do something with that property sooner than later, if that helps.
I have a question about the charter schools versus traditional public schools. And I was wondering if like you talked to people in the community about why they ended up moving to a charter school, I guess, and then kind of like how the fact that they get less local funding, like whether that's affected outcomes in those charter schools. And if maybe with like the split taxes is like the goal to move people back into traditional public schools, like would those split taxes revenue go to the traditional public schools rather than the charter schools?
I think those are two good questions. I'll start with the one I think is probably easiest. So we had an advisory council for the project that included teachers, administrators, parents. They reviewed, so we did some infographics, some executive summaries, some research. They reviewed all that stuff. And I say that contextually to share, like, most parents and even most educators aren't really aware of what the financial operations are in the state of Michigan. So I'll use the largest county, which is Wayne. Wayne County has 115 school districts, some traditional, some charter, some in more wealthy pockets, some in less resource pockets. And so you'll have a national heritage come in and say, oh, we put this charter school in this wealthy geographic location. It's a shiny new building. But as a parent, do you know that that school is only getting 6 meals, even though they're in the wealthy part of the state? You don't. And so it's always going to be under resourced because that's how it started. Now, across the street, I go to Plymouth Canton, and Plymouth Canton can raise millage at any rate they want to, right? But they're not a part of, a charter is not a part of the home district. So they don't have that tax base. So that's the caveat about people sending their kids to charter schools. Most often they don't know the financial implications, but they are trying to find something that is a benefit to their children. And so I think that's a problem that we have to fix as leaders, educators, researchers in this space. On the split rate piece for charters and traditional, split rate would not benefit charters because charters are again capped. Split rate would go into a pool for that municipal. So in Michigan in particular, traditional districts are treated like municipal governments, like the city of Detroit or the airport is its own. Those are entities that can tax. They can put on your tax bill that you pay a taxation, right? And charter schools don't have that. So they would not be able to participate in the split rate opportunity unless there was a constitutional minimum, of course. And what Smart and I didn't share with you is that before Proposal A passed in 93, it failed, I think, 11 times leading up to that. It's really hard to do. It depends on who you talk to and what you read. The amendment was bottlenecked in a way where it was like choose the worst of the bad options to vote on, right? The way the language was written. So
I mean, and the way that the data is represented in Michigan is it shows that charter schools are functionally doing well. But again, you have to look at it contextually. So to Dr. Caldwell's point, if you put, I don't know, a charter school in Birmingham, more than likely you're going to have a certain set of students that attend that school, which is different if you put that school in Flint, where they already have challenges. So not only are you coming in with an inequity, the parents are just looking for choice. They're looking for better choice. So they are assuming that charter school will be the better choice because they have a little more control, they have a little more say-so, and that's perception. But then they're also looking for services that charter schools can't necessarily offer, such as special education at the level that a traditional school could offer. But it puts a burden on the traditional schools because if the charter school is unable to offer it, who has to offer it? The traditional school where the charter school is located. So there's just a lot of things that go into the decision when you're talking about charter versus traditional.
Thank you.
Can I go next? Hi guys, thank you all so much for this presentation. I'm really interested in it and there's a lot of information in there and I really want to dive deeper into a lot of it. So if one of my questions has something to do with that was on slide 7, apologies. But coming from a sort of measuring student poverty and administrative data background, and and knowing that there's, what I'm really interested in is, do you know if your free and reduced price lunch measure is catching those kids at 135% of the federal poverty line versus 180? And I ask that because if there's a bunch of CEP schools, particularly in, or community eligibility provision schools, sorry, in those particularly urban areas, which is where they usually are, those numbers kind of fluctuate or can be less reliable. So that's sort of my first question, and then I have a follow-up depending on the answer.
So Caldwell, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, so I'll just start by saying this. The FRL is what we have right now. And we know that I think it's NCES is working on another way to determine how we could measure poverty at a better rate, so we can capture all students. I know in Flint, we have some parents that don't report FRL, so we are missing a population of students. But it was the best thing that we had at the time. So if we could, I mean, if this new development of how we measure poverty actually is useful for us, then we'll implement it. But at this time, no.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did you have something, Dr. Credible?
So this is a point of tension for, I think, us along the work, right? So you've heard me through the presentation, like very carefully say free and reduced lunch provision. And so, our colleagues on the project, like we vacillated between like, these kids are, poor. No, they're not. No kid that you ask right now knows that they're poor. And so I say that with a lot of animation in my voice, because I'd like to come up with some scientific, like we want to count kids, right? We want to be able to tell stories, but I also don't want to dehumanize the fact that like they didn't make that decision necessarily. And maybe because of the way we've structured things over history, their parents didn't make all those decisions either, right? Some of the things are kind of predetermined for you. So what I'm most interested in is, can we explore measures and quantification in ways that don't dehumanize individuals, but still allow us to problematize and then say, okay, here's what that problem analysis told us, and then let's come up with some solutions. That's not answering your question. It's just my goal when I talk about like we're trying to ask questions and contribute science. I think there's some work for us to do.
Yeah, that's something that in the measuring student poverty sort of realm, and me and some colleagues and whatnot, is what we have is this binary measure, because that's what we've always had, because that's what school food programs have used, versus what is there sort of an index that takes a more holistic student approach. There's that, knowing that a student's household income is a component to their household resources and what that contributes to the school, to their resources within the school.
I mean, we see you though, Emily. We see you.
So what I want to think about is like what I worry about is if you're particularly looking at urban school districts that are likely to have community eligibility provision, and those are the ones not turning in those school lunch forms, then you're underestimating poverty, or you're looking at poverty on a much more specific part of the spectrum, like a much lower end of the spectrum, comparing it to potentially more affluent areas who don't have community eligibility provision, and then they're turning in their forms. So two things you might think about doing is using your, which you didn't ask for, but direct certification numbers. If you have those available to you, that's going to compare apples to apples, and it's because it's all states, or excuse me, all schools have to use it. There's no, you're at least, it's going to be a lower threshold for poverty, 135% of the federal poverty line, and you're not going to get some of those people who would otherwise turn in forms, but at least it would be consistent across schools within your state. The other thing that Erica put is our modeled estimates of poverty in schools that we're currently updating. I don't think we have it for 18-19 publicly yet, but I do believe we have it where we've created it. We just haven't put it on the portal yet. So if that is something that you're interested in, I'd be more than happy to share
Definitely.
that with you.
Yeah, while you were talking, I was reading your report. So that's why I said we see you. No,
Yeah.
we're always interested in strengthening and actually collaborating with others. And just real quick to Maggie, there are no exclusions. If you live in Michigan and you're retired, you still pay property tax. So, but no, that I'm reading it now. That's kind of what we do. So thank you for that.
No, happy to answer any questions.
Yeah.
But I think it's what you're doing is great. It's stuff that I've always thought about and wanted to do, just haven't. So I'm really excited to see you doing it and more interested in reading more about it.
Well, shoot us your email address because I may have questions. I like to
Sure,
see
sure.
read.
I'll throw it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
That's
She don't know what she just did, Caldwell. She don't know.
I like making new friends.
Emily sounds like she really enjoys direct certification. I'm sitting here thinking to myself, there's no person who would know direct certification unless they actually work with it. So I'm sitting here like, no, she really knows.
Listen, let's just say, I guess at the end of my PhD training, when they said introduce yourself and what you work on, I kind of thought back and thought, my name's Emily Gutierrez, and I guess I know about school foods programs and direct certification and school poverty. It just happened that way.
This is great.
Thank y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Caldwell. Thank you, Dr. Smart. Thank you all for the great conversation afterwards. It's been fantastic. Happy to help with sharing email addresses or anything else that would be useful for future collaboration. And please come back again as the work evolves.
Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you very much for having us. Appreciate seeing everybody. If you have questions or critiques, you can shoot us emails. We're really love to talk about this stuff. So no hesitation there. Erica, I'll look for your next update on the grandparent scalability
I hope it comes soon.
this afternoon.
Have a great afternoon to everybody.